Let me ask you something. How well do you really know the people who live next door to you? You wave at them in the morning. Maybe you've shared a short conversation over the fence. Perhaps you've lent them a cup of sugar or helped drag their bin to the curb when they were out of town. You know their faces, you know their car, you know what time they leave for work. But do you actually know them? Because I thought I did. I genuinely believe that. And then over the course of about 9 months, 9 completely ordinary months, I watched my quiet, peaceful street turn into something that felt like a scene from a crime thriller. Except this wasn't a movie. There was no script, no director yelling cut. This was my home, my driveway. Why? My doorbell camera recording every terrifying moment of it. By the time it was over, a man had been beaten within an inch of his life. 3 criminals had been arrested. A dog had been abandoned. And a woman had stood crying on my street in the middle of the night, not knowing if her husband was even still alive. And me? I was sitting in the dark watching all of it through a 2-inch phone screen, too scared to make a sound. This is the true story of the neighbors next door. To understand how strange things got, you need to understand how normal everything was before. About 4 years ago, my partner Marcus and I bought our very first home together. It was nothing fancy. A 2-bedroom terrace house on Elmfield Close, a quiet little street in the kind of neighborhood where people still say good morning to each other. Our neighbors at the time, a retired couple named David and Sandra, were honestly some of the kindest people we'd ever met. They'd have us over for tea. They'd water our plants when we went away. Real, proper neighbors. Life was good. And then, about 18 months in, David and Sandra announced they were selling up. Downsizing, they said, moving closer to their daughter. We were gutted. But then, and this felt like fate at the time, they told us they were putting their old house on the market. Their house, the one directly next door to ours, the one with a proper driveway, a double garage, and an actual bathtub. We'd been showering in a tiny cubicle for 18 months. We bought it within weeks. Suddenly, we had more space, more comfort, and the bonus, we got to choose our new neighbors because now our old house next door was the one going up for sale. We went through the letters from potential buyers carefully. It's a thing people do in parts of Europe. You write a letter about yourself, why you want the house, what kind of neighbors you'll be. We liked this idea. It felt personal. Eventually, we settled on a young couple, Daniel and Petra, a pair in their mid-30s who'd moved to the area from abroad. They seemed warm, polite, and genuinely excited about the home. We met them briefly during the handover. They spoke to us in English rather than the local language, but that was fine. We exchanged numbers, had a bit of small talk. Everything felt perfectly normal. We had absolutely no idea what was coming. It started small, almost imperceptibly small. The kind of things you brush off individually, but that start to stack up over time into something you can't ignore. The first thing we noticed was the noise, not constant noise, not the ordinary kind of thumping and clattering that comes with new neighbors settling in. This was different. It was erratic, unpredictable. Sometimes it was midnight banging, heavy, rhythmic, like furniture being dragged. Other times it was music. Loud, jarring music appearing with zero warning at 2 or 3 in the morning. It would happen once, then nothing for a week, then it would happen again. We never knew when to expect it. Then there was the car incident. One afternoon in late March, I noticed Daniel pulling onto the driveway in a state. His car, a fairly new gray hatchback, had damage on both sides, not small scratches. Deep, ugly gouges running along both doors like he'd scraped something at significant speed. I asked what happened. It was a casual question, the kind you'd ask any neighbor. He told me he'd caught a concrete bollard on one side, and on the other side, a lorry had swung a turn too wide and caught him. Now, I'm not an accident investigator, but I remember thinking the damage on both sides looked remarkably similar in depth and angle, like 2 parallel scrapes. And I'd never heard of a car collecting 2 completely separate accidents in a single day in 2 completely unrelated locations. I smiled and said something like bad luck and went inside. I didn't say what I was actually thinking. And looking back, maybe I should have trusted that instinct more. It was a Thursday evening, around 6 o'clock. I was in the kitchen when my phone rang. It was Daniel, and he was panicking. He was barely coherent at first, speaking fast, his voice all over the place. I managed to piece together that there were men outside his house. Men who were tampering with the security cameras. He was saying they were moving them, rotating them away from the doors. He sounded genuinely terrified. He begged me to go outside and check. Marcus and I went out together, and there they were. Two men we'd never seen before standing at the side of Daniel and Petra's house. One of them was reaching up toward the camera mounted near the side gate. The other stood watching the street. We called the police immediately. It took them 22 minutes to arrive. In those 22 minutes, the two men had gone. No sign of forced entry, nothing visibly stolen. The officers took a statement, looked around, and eventually left. But here's the thing that stuck with me. As the police were still there, Petra came screeching onto the street in her car, clearly having been called by Daniel. She bolted inside, straight to their little French bulldog, frantic with worry. Daniel arrived differently. I watched him walk down Elmfield Close from the direction of the main road. Slowly, calmly, hands in pockets. He'd parked his car several streets away by the looks of it and walked in. Not the behavior of a man rushing home after being told there were intruders outside his house. But the detail that really unsettled me came later that night when Marcus reviewed the doorbell footage. In the minutes before the incident, one of the two men had stood at the door, and they were talking. Having a full conversation, gesturing, nodding, pointing toward the houses on either side. And they were speaking in the same Eastern European language that Daniel and Petra spoke between themselves. Nothing was stolen. No one was charged. When I mentioned to the police that the whole thing felt staged, like a reconnaissance visit, they took the note and I never heard from them again. I want to be clear about something. At this stage, we still weren't sure what to think. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe Daniel genuinely had an enemy. Maybe we were building a conspiracy out of fragments. We were about to find out the truth, and it was worse than anything we'd imagined. 1 week later, it was a Saturday evening, and I was at a housewarming party at a friend's place about 20 minutes away. Marcus had stayed home. Around 9 o'clock, I got a text from him. Music's going mental next door again. I sent back a yikes and didn't think much of it. Then, about 4 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Marcus. In his voice, I knew instantly something was very wrong. You need to come home. Right now. Something has happened. I left immediately. Here's what Marcus told me on the phone as I drove back. He'd been sitting in our living room when he heard what he described as an engine absolutely screaming, revving to breaking point. Then a tremendous crash. He looked out the front window just in time to see Daniel and Petra's car. The same gray hatchback, sitting in our front garden. It had come through the low front wall, torn up the grass, and then reversed back and smashed directly into the front door of Daniel and Petra's house. Two men were loading it. They were moving quickly back and forth between the house and the car, carrying flat-screen televisions, professional speaker systems, high-end audio equipment, the kind of gear that takes years to accumulate and would cost tens of thousands of pounds to replace. Stacking it into the boot, cramming it into the back seats, and Marcus recognized them. They were the same two men from the week before. The police this time were there in 7 minutes. I pulled onto the street just as two patrol cars were boxing in the hatchback. The officers approached the car with the men still inside. Standard procedure. Asked them to step out, asked for identification. The men claimed they didn't have any documents on them. Then the man behind the wheel did something extraordinary. He looked the officer in the eye and said he was Daniel Kovac, using Daniel's full name, his exact complete name, as if he'd been coached on it. Now here's where it fell apart. In the 9 months that Daniel and Petra had lived next door to us, Daniel had never, not once, spoken a word of English fluently. Our conversations had always been in short, broken exchanges. He knew some local phrases, yes, but was not conversational. This man spoke the local language perfectly, confidently, with a distinct Eastern European accent, but fluently. The officer, to his credit, didn't miss a beat. He asked the man to repeat something Daniel had told officers when they previously visited the property. There was a pause, and then the driver slammed the car into reverse. What followed was a pursuit through the streets around Elmfield Close, cars screeching, police radios crackling, neighbors appearing at windows. It ended 2 streets away when the officers managed to cut the car off. Both men were dragged out and arrested, but Marcus was still watching the house, and he could hear movement inside. The police went back in, and they pulled out a third man who'd been hiding in the back room. 3 arrests, 3 men, all inside or escaping from a house that supposedly only 2 people lived in. Marcus and I were inside with one of the officers, going through the process of reporting the damage to our property. Our garden wall destroyed, the turf torn up, the driveway scraped. When our doorbell camera pinged, someone was at the front door. I turned to look at the screen, and I genuinely didn't recognize him at first. It was Daniel, but a version of Daniel I'd never seen. His face was unrecognizable. Both eyes were swollen, one completely shut. His lip was split open, still bleeding. His jaw looked wrong, like something had been displaced. His arm hung at an angle that arms aren't supposed to hang at, and from the wrist to the elbow, there were what looked like defensive wounds. Cuts. The kind you get when you put your arms up to protect yourself from something sharp. He looked feral. That's the only word I can use. His eyes were wild, darting, unfocused. He looked like a man who had been through something I cannot fully imagine. The officer with us went to the door, tried to get Daniel to come inside, to sit down, to let the paramedics look at him. Daniel refused, flatly, completely. He would not cooperate. He would not file a report. He would not say what had happened to him, who had done it, or where he had been. With no victim willing to speak, the officer had no legal ground to hold him. He went back to his own house. The door closed. Own house, the door closed. An hour later, our doorbell pinged again. It was Daniel, still a mess but slightly more composed. I went to the door. He looked at me with this hollow, exhausted expression and said he was sorry for the noise, for everything. And then, almost in the same breath, he told me something I was not prepared to hear. He said he'd been having an affair. He said his wife had found out, and that she had sent people after him. Those words just hung in the air between us. She sent people after him. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He meant it literally. He believed, or was claiming to believe, that the men who had beaten him, who had ransacked his own home, who had been casing the property the week before had been sent by Petra, his wife. He asked if he could sleep at our house that night. I wanted to help him. I genuinely did. But I also had to be honest with myself. This man had connections to criminals. There had just been 3 arrests on our street. Someone had clearly wanted him seriously hurt, or worse. Letting him sleep in our home felt like inviting whatever was hunting him through our front door. We said no, but Marcus offered to drive him to the hospital, which we did. We dropped him off at the A&E entrance at around 10:30. We told him we were staying at a friend's house that night, that we didn't feel safe at home. We lied. We drove back and went straight inside, locked every single door, turned off the lights, and sat very quietly in the dark. It was just past 1 in the morning when our dog Archie woke up. Archie is a pretty relaxed animal. He doesn't bark at every car or rustle in the garden. But he has this one specific sound, a low continuous growl from deep in his chest, that he only ever uses when there is a person at our front door. Marcus and I looked at each other in the dark. I picked up my phone and opened the doorbell camera app. Daniel was standing on our porch. He'd come back from the hospital. He was ringing the bell, knocking on the door, his head turning every few seconds to look up and down the street. We sat completely still and didn't answer. Then, headlights swept across the front of the house. A car was turning slowly onto Elmfield Close. On the camera, I watched Daniel's whole body react. He flinched. Then, in one quick movement, he stepped off the porch, crossed our driveway, and crouched down behind our cars, pressing himself into the shadows, hiding. The car stopped. A woman got out. It was Petra. She walked toward the front door of their house, paused, and then turned toward our driveway. In the camera, I watched her eyes find him. She'd spotted him. She walked toward him slowly, and then she stepped under the streetlight, and she began to cry. Not quiet, dignified crying. This was the kind of crying you can't control. Raw, guttural, coming from somewhere deep in the chest. It echoed off the houses. I could hear it faintly through our walls. Daniel said nothing. He just stood there. She kept asking questions, her voice rising and falling between sobs, words I couldn't make out. And he just stood there, mute and bleeding. Eventually, they both got in the car, and they drove away. We didn't see either of them for 3 full days. On the 4th day, Petra came back alone. She knocked on our door quietly. Her eyes were red. She looked like she hadn't slept properly in days. She found the dog, their little French bulldog, still inside the house. Apparently, he'd been there the whole time, fed by a friend who'd been given a spare key, but still alone in that house. She told us very quietly, very simply, that she didn't think she'd be seeing Daniel again. She didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. The arrested men were charged, but the case wound its way through the courts slowly, as these things do. I followed up with the police twice about the staged break-in from the week before the reconnaissance visit, but was told there wasn't sufficient evidence to connect it to the arrests. As for Daniel, we never found out the full story. We don't know if the car damage from March was related. We don't know who he'd gotten himself mixed up with or how deep it went or whether the affair was real or a cover story for something else entirely. We don't know if he's even still alive. I've thought about this a lot since it all happened. And I keep coming back to the same question: were there signs I should have caught earlier? The car damage, the erratic late-night noise, the way he walked calmly to his own break-in, the conversation on the doorbell camera in a language I couldn't understand, the way he parked 3 streets away. Each thing on its own meant nothing, but together they painted a picture I just wasn't willing to look at. I think most of us are wired to give our neighbors the benefit of the doubt. We want to believe we live in safe, ordinary places. We want to believe the people around us are living safe, ordinary lives. Because if they aren't, if something dark is happening just a few feet from your front door, what does that mean for you? It means you're not as safe as you thought. And that's a terrifying thing to sit with. But here's the other thing I learned, something I didn't expect. In the middle of all that chaos and fear and uncertainty, there were still moments of profound, aching humanity. A woman standing under a streetlight, sobbing, not knowing what had become of the man she married. A little dog alone in a house, waiting for someone to come home. A confession from a beaten, broken man on our doorstep at 10:30 at night. Whatever the real story was, drugs, debts, organized crime, a marriage that had curdled into something dangerous. There were real people inside it. People who had somehow ended up somewhere they never planned to be. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Because it could have been anyone on that street. It could have been anyone's neighbor. If this story made you look out the window and think twice about your own neighbors, I completely understand. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever had a neighbor who turned out to be hiding something? Or have you had an experience that felt completely off, but you couldn't quite put your finger on why? I read every comment, every single one. And your stories are sometimes more extraordinary than anything I could find. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is where true stories like this one live. Subscribe if you want more, and make sure you hit the bell, because the algorithm has a habit of keeping these videos from reaching people who actually want to see them. I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, stay safe, and maybe, just maybe, learn a few words in your neighbor's language. You never know when it might matter.